David Andrews stepped onto the plane with an unassuming grace, dressed in a casual shirt and jeans, carrying a worn leather briefcase. He'd just closed a multi-million-dollar deal, but no one looking at him would suspect it. David preferred it that way. His wealth was never meant to define him, only to help him shape the world in quiet, meaningful ways. Today was supposed to be a normal day, a flight home after weeks of exhausting negotiations. Yet, as he settled into his seat, something in the air felt slightly off. The flight attendant, Claire, had a long career behind her. Once passionate about her job, the years had worn her down. She'd seen passengers from every walk of life, but her patience had thinned with time, and her prejudices had started to creep into her behavior. It was subtle, just enough for people to feel uncomfortable without causing outright alarm. Today, as she watched David get seated, her mind quickly ran through judgments she didn't realize were so ingrained. She glanced over at David, who smiled politely, but her response was curt, a slight nod before she continued down the aisle. David felt the slight tension but brushed it off. He was a patient man, used to both subtle and overt judgments. Life had taught him that his best response was always dignity. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a book, and prepared to unwind on the flight. Minutes passed, and the plane was soon in the air. Claire moved down the aisle, distributing drinks and snacks. When she reached David's row, she skipped over him without a second glance. The passengers beside him noticed and exchanged puzzled looks. David decided to let it slide. It wasn't worth a confrontation. However, he could sense the eyes of others in his row, and he knew they, too, saw what was happening. Small murmurs began to ripple around as passengers noticed Claire's selective attention. Some whispered, while others merely exchanged uncomfortable glances. Halfway through the flight, David adjusted in his seat to retrieve a file from his bag. In doing so, his elbow accidentally nudged the tray of the passenger beside him, causing a slight spill of coffee. The man brushed it off with a laugh, assuring David it was no big deal. But Claire appeared immediately, scolding David in front of the entire row. "Some people don't know how to behave," she remarked, shaking her head as she dabbed at the spill. Her tone was clipped, her body language sharp. The passengers around David stiffened, clearly noticing her behavior. David took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. He looked up at Claire, his gaze steady. "Excuse me, but it was an accident," he said calmly, his voice even. Claire ignored his explanation and continued dabbing at the spill, muttering under her breath about people who don't belong in business class. Her words stung, not just for David, but for everyone nearby who felt the sting of prejudice. People started to pull out their phones, subtly recording the unfolding scene, their disapproval evident. David noticed this but didn't comment. He wasn't one for public drama, even if he knew he could handle it. The tension grew thicker as the flight continued. David did his best to stay composed, ignoring Claire's snide looks and whispers as she moved up and down the aisle. His calm demeanor didn't waver, but it was clear that Claire's prejudice was becoming more blatant. At one point, she loudly suggested to another attendant that some people might be in the wrong seat, though she didn't mention David by name. Passengers around him looked visibly uncomfortable, their eyes darting between David and Claire. Eventually, David decided enough was enough. He quietly flagged down a different attendant, who seemed more sympathetic, and asked if he could have a brief conversation with a senior staff member after landing. The attendant nodded, understanding immediately that something was wrong, and assured him she would arrange it. Claire noticed this interaction, her gaze hardening. She marched over and addressed David, her voice icy. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, the sarcasm thinly veiled. David looked her in the eye, refusing to let her shake his calm. "I would like to speak with someone about how this situation has been handled," he replied evenly. "What situation?" Claire scoffed. "All I've done is my job. If you're feeling uncomfortable, maybe you should consider your behavior." Her words lingered in the air, sharp and biting, and for a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then, In a swift, shocking move, Claire's frustration boiled over. She raised her hand and slapped David across the face. A gasp echoed through the cabin. Passengers froze in disbelief, their eyes wide with shock. The slap was loud, jarring, and it left a mark, not just on David's face, but in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Phones that had previously been discreetly capturing her remarks were now held openly, recording the aftermath of this outrageous incident. David's face was calm, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he straightened, his gaze meeting Claire's with a quiet intensity that left her momentarily speechless. She had expected him to react, to lash out, or cause a scene, but he remained calm, steady, dignified. His silence only amplified the tension. Another attendant rushed over, horrified at what had just happened. She placed a hand on Claire's shoulder, trying to defuse the situation. "Claire, I think you need to step aside," she whispered urgently. But it was too late. David, with a quiet authority, stated, "I will be speaking with your management when we land." This has gone far beyond a misunderstanding. Claire looked around, realizing that nearly every passenger in the vicinity was watching, judging. Some were openly glaring, others shaking their heads. A few passengers even called out in David's defense, demanding an explanation for such treatment. Claire's confidence visibly wavered. She hadn't anticipated such backlash, nor had she expected the calm, powerful presence of the man she had been targeting. As the plane began its descent, a feeling of anticipation settled over the cabin. Passengers whispered to each other, speculating about who David really was and why he had handled everything with such poise. In the silence that followed the slap, something had shifted. People felt compelled to take a stand, realizing they'd just witnessed an act of injustice. When the plane finally touched down, David stood, gathered his belongings, and waited as other passengers disembarked. A few stopped to offer words of support or nods of encouragement. One man, an older gentleman, placed a hand on David's shoulder and whispered, "Good luck, sir. We're all rooting for you." As David made his way off the plane, Claire was nowhere to be seen. She had been ushered to the back, clearly overwhelmed by the backlash. The sympathetic attendant escorted David to the terminal, where the airline's senior management team had already been alerted to the incident and was waiting to hear his account. As he walked through the terminal, David thought of how a simple flight had turned into an ordeal, and how, if he had been someone else, he might not have had the resources to make his voice heard. He realized that this was no longer just about him. It was about the way people were treated when no one thought anyone would notice. As David entered the airport terminal, he was met by two members of the airline's senior management, both looking uncomfortable and clearly aware that a serious incident had occurred on their flight. The sympathetic flight attendant had already given them a preliminary account of what happened, but they still had questions, and more than a hint of apprehension. They escorted David to a quiet private office away from the bustling crowds, a space reserved for handling issues involving VIP clients. Despite the growing storm, David remained collected and poised, sitting down and waiting patiently for them to initiate the conversation. The first executive, a middle-aged man named Jonathan, sat across from David with a clipboard, his expression a mix of professionalism and worry. Beside him sat Amanda, a public relations specialist with the airline, who had been hastily called in to manage what was now being considered a reputational risk. Amanda's eyes darted nervously between David and Jonathan, clearly understanding that this situation had the potential to spiral out of control if mishandled. "Mr. Andrews," Jonathan began, clearing his throat. "First of all, we'd like to extend our sincerest apologies for what occurred during your flight today. This is not reflective of our airline's values or the service we strive to provide." David nodded, acknowledging the sentiment but saying nothing. He wanted them to fully understand the weight of what had transpired before he responded. Jonathan continued, "We have received preliminary statements from several passengers and crew members, and the details, well, they're certainly troubling. We'd like to hear your account of the incident to make sure we understand everything." David took a deep breath, his voice steady but firm. He recounted the events without embellishment, describing Claire's initial dismissive attitude, the unnecessary scolding over a simple accident, and finally, the slap that had stunned the entire cabin into silence. He explained how he had remained calm, hoping to de-escalate, even when Claire's behavior became openly hostile. As he spoke, Jonathan and Amanda had exchanged uneasy glances, fully aware of the gravity of each detail. "I want to make it clear," David concluded, "that this isn't just about the slap. That was the breaking point, yes, but this was about a pattern of behavior, one that reflects not just on Claire, but on your airline. Had I been someone less composed or less confident, things could have ended much worse. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because incidents like this shouldn't happen, not to anyone, regardless of who they are or what they look like." Jonathan's pen paused mid-note as he absorbed David's words. Amanda's face softened, realizing that David's calm critique went beyond personal grievance. It was a call for systemic change. "Mr. Andrews," Amanda interjected, her tone almost pleading, "we're committed to addressing this matter appropriately. We hope you'll allow us to make this right, both for you and for our other passengers who may have been affected." David gave a thoughtful nod, and for the first time, the weight of his influence began to subtly reveal itself. "I'm glad to hear that, Amanda. But making this right isn't just about an apology or disciplinary action. I believe this incident calls for deeper changes. Retraining, perhaps even reassessing how your staff are taught to interact with passengers from different backgrounds." Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly. He understood that what David was suggesting required a significant overhaul, one that would cost time, resources, and potentially shift the airline's policies in a way that could attract scrutiny. But David's gaze remained unyielding, his expression making it clear that he was not here for mere platitudes. As the conversation unfolded, a subtle but profound realization began to settle over the two airline representatives. They had initially viewed David as a passenger wronged, a potential PR issue to be smoothed over with carefully worded apologies and perhaps a generous travel voucher. But now, in the quiet assertiveness of his words, they sensed a much deeper purpose. David was here not only as a passenger but as a figure with the power to initiate real change. Jonathan cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Mr. Andrews, we fully understand the need for concrete actions. We're prepared to investigate this incident thoroughly, and we'd like to work with you on the reforms you've suggested. If you have ideas for sensitivity and inclusivity training or other improvements, we're open to your input." David considered this, nodding slightly. "I appreciate that, Jonathan. I'll think over some suggestions and get back to you. But this isn't just about input. If I'm to be involved, I'll need to know that the airline is truly committed, that this isn't just a one-off response to a PR issue." At this, Amanda's expression turned resolute. "We're committed, Mr. Andrews," she said, with a firmness that surprised even her. "The truth is, incidents like this have come up in smaller ways before, but they never reached this level of severity. It's clear we need to address these underlying issues, and with your guidance, I believe we can." The discussion moved toward logistics, with David outlining initial ideas for a partnership in which he could contribute to developing a training program focused on empathy, sensitivity, and respect for all passengers. The airline executives listened intently, their initial defensiveness melting away as they realized the opportunity they had. This wasn't just a crisis, it was a chance for meaningful change. Meanwhile, word of the incident had begun to spread beyond the airline. Passengers who had witnessed the slap, still outraged and determined to hold Claire accountable, shared their perspectives on social media. A few influential voices took up the story, amplifying it across platforms, with headlines reading, "Airline in hot water after passenger assaulted by flight attendant," and "Billionaire passenger advocates for change after shocking in-flight incident." While David's name had not yet been publicly attached, the news of a billionaire taking a stand against discrimination was already causing a stir. Back in the private office, David wrapped up the meeting, standing to leave. Jonathan and Amanda shook his hand, each of them more solemn now, fully aware of the road ahead. As David walked out, he passed a group of passengers waiting nearby who recognized him and nodded in support, some even offering words of encouragement. "Thank you for standing up," one older man said, reaching out to shake David's hand. "People need to know that respect is a right, not a privilege." David smiled, his response quiet but sincere. It's important to speak up, especially for those who may not have a voice in situations like these. As he moved through the airport, he reflected on the strange turn his day had taken. What began as an ordinary flight had become a defining moment, one he knew he couldn't walk away from. He was determined to use his resources and influence not to punish but to build something better. That thought fueled him as he headed to his next destination, a quiet resolve setting in as he prepared for what lay ahead. By the time he left the airport, his thoughts had shifted from mere frustration to a broader vision of change. An initiative, perhaps to promote equity in customer service, one that could reshape how passengers of all backgrounds were treated, not just on flights, but in various public spaces. David's quiet resolve took on a life of its own. What had begun as a personal affront had grown into a cause, one that David was now committed to seeing through. The following day, as news of the incident continued to spread, David's phone rang with calls from media outlets, industry colleagues, and even prominent civil rights organizations. People were talking about the incident as a turning point, a wake-up call for better treatment and respect in customer service industries. David, however, was determined to keep his response measured, aiming not for sensationalism, but for a genuine push toward positive change. A few days later, David was scheduled to meet with the CEO of the airline, an appointment he hadn't expected to take on with such urgency, but one he knew could create lasting impact. He was met by a team of executives, including Jonathan and Amanda from the previous day, who all seemed visibly tense. David walked in with his usual calm demeanor, his presence instantly commanding attention. As he settled into his seat, the CEO, a composed woman named Eleanor, extended her hand with an earnest expression. "Mr. Andrews, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I'm deeply sorry that our airline failed you, and we're committed to making amends, not just for you but for everyone who may have been affected by similar experiences," she began, her tone conveying a mixture of regret and determination. David acknowledged her statement with a nod. "Thank you, Eleanor. I appreciate that, and I want to be clear. I didn't come here to focus on my personal grievance. I'm here because I believe this incident is part of a much larger issue, one that affects countless people who don't have the platform or resources to speak out. I want to work with your team to develop a solution that isn't just a band-aid for this incident, but a meaningful shift in how all customers are treated." The CEO and her team listened intently, absorbing the weight of David's words. Eleanor glanced at her executives, signaling her readiness to commit. "We're open to your ideas, David. In fact, we've already taken steps to address what happened on your flight. The flight attendant in question has been placed on leave, and we're in the process of reevaluating our training protocols. However, I understand you may have a larger vision in mind." David leaned forward, his hands clasped thoughtfully. "It's a good start, but I think we can do more. I propose we create an initiative, a formal program that not only educates staff on inclusivity and respect, but also encourages them to address their unconscious biases. This isn't just about changing attitudes. It's about building a culture that values every individual, regardless of their background or status." The room fell silent as David continued, his voice calm but unyielding. "In addition, I suggest we involve community leaders and experts in cultural sensitivity to help design a training regimen that's both effective and transformative. We should also implement a feedback system where passengers can share their experiences, both positive and negative, in real time. This would allow for immediate intervention if similar issues arise." Eleanor took a deep breath, visibly impressed by David's proposal. "This is ambitious, David. We've never considered such a comprehensive program, but I see the value in it. If you are willing, I'd like for you to lead this initiative with us. Your perspective would be invaluable, not just as a passenger, but as someone with a vested interest in societal progress. David was slightly taken aback by the offer, but he saw in it the opportunity he had been hoping for. He hadn't expected to be at the forefront of such a movement, but perhaps that was precisely what made him the right person to lead it. After a brief pause, he nodded, a small smile forming. "I'd be honored to help. Let's make this a model for other companies to follow, a commitment to treating people with the dignity they deserve, no matter who they are." They spent the next few hours refining the proposal, discussing the logistics, potential obstacles, and long-term goals. The program would be named Equal Footing, representing the idea that every passenger and every staff member stands on equal ground, deserving of mutual respect and understanding. David's background in leadership and his personal commitment to equity provided a solid foundation for the initiative, and his ideas resonated with the team. The final proposal included not only sensitivity training but also a mentorship program, where employees could openly discuss and address their biases in a safe, constructive environment. The program was set to launch in 6 months, with David agreeing to help oversee its development. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor expressed her gratitude once more. "David, thank you for turning this incident into something meaningful. I believe this initiative will not only transform our airline, but also inspire others to reevaluate how they treat their customers." David smiled, standing to shake her hand. "This is just the beginning. I have no doubt that we'll see positive change, not just here, but industry-wide." In the weeks that followed, news of the Equal Footing initiative spread rapidly. People were captivated by the idea of a prominent billionaire working alongside a major airline to champion respect and inclusivity. Community leaders praised the program, while industry experts hailed it as a bold step toward creating a more compassionate corporate culture. David received calls from executives of other airlines, hospitality companies, and even large corporations interested in implementing similar programs. Meanwhile, Claire, the flight attendant at the center of the incident, was undergoing her own transformation. Her initial defensiveness had given way to deep introspection. Confronted with the consequences of her actions and the public's response, Claire began to understand the impact of her prejudice. After being placed on leave, she attended workshops on empathy and bias, participating in sessions where people shared their experiences of discrimination. Hearing their stories struck a nerve in Claire, forcing her to reflect on her own behavior. She realized that her biases weren't just hurtful, they were destructive, reinforcing harmful stereotypes and marginalizing those who deserved respect and kindness. One afternoon, Claire reached out to David, requesting a private meeting. David agreed, curious to see if her remorse was genuine or simply an attempt to clear her name. They met in a quiet coffee shop, away from the public eye. Claire looked visibly different, her usual confidence replaced by a somber humility. "David, I know I can't undo what I did," Claire began, her voice trembling. "I was wrong, and I realize now that my actions were not only unfair to you, but to everyone who witnessed them. I've spent the past few weeks learning about the harm that prejudice can cause, and it's been eye-opening. I'm truly sorry." David listened quietly, noting the sincerity in her tone. After a moment, he nodded. "Claire, acknowledging your mistakes is a big step, but understanding why you acted that way and making an effort to change is even more important." Claire nodded, her expression one of determination. "I want to make things right, not just with you but with others I may have hurt over the years. If there's any way I can contribute to the initiative, I'd like to be part of it." David studied her carefully, recognizing the potential for her story to serve as a powerful lesson. "If you're serious about this, I'll support you. The Equal Footing initiative could benefit from your perspective, especially if you're willing to share your experience and help others avoid similar mistakes." Claire agreed, and together they worked out a plan for her to participate in the program. She would speak openly about her journey, her initial biases, and the hard truths she had faced in the aftermath of the incident. She would be a cautionary tale, an example of how unchecked prejudice can lead to devastating consequences, but also a symbol of hope for those willing to change. As the months passed, Equal Footing officially launched, with Claire's story becoming a central part of the training curriculum. David's vision had come to life, transforming a single painful incident into a powerful movement. Employees across the airline embraced the program, many of them sharing their own stories of growth and understanding. The airline's reputation rebounded as word of the initiative spread, with passengers praising the newfound warmth and inclusivity they experienced on flights. David watched with quiet pride as the initiative took off, knowing that he had done more than just demand an apology. He had sparked a movement that was making a real difference. And as he reflected on the journey, he realized that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could lead to the most profound changes, not just for individuals but for entire communities. The experience had transformed him as well, reminding him that wealth and influence were best used not for personal gain, but to uplift and empower others. It wasn't about being right. It was about making things right, creating a legacy built not on accolades but on compassion and respect. And with each story that emerged from the Equal Footing program, David knew that his efforts had been worth it. As Equal Footing began to make waves across the airline and beyond, the impact rippled outward in ways that David hadn't anticipated. Community groups, advocates, and leaders from various industries were reaching out, all wanting to learn more about the program. People saw it as more than just an airline policy. It was becoming a new standard for customer relations and workplace culture. David found himself being invited to speak at events, from corporate seminars to university lectures, where people listened intently to the story of how a single incident on a flight had sparked a broader conversation about empathy, equality, and respect. The public's response to the program was overwhelming. Social media buzzed with praise and testimonies from passengers who shared how they noticed a difference when they flew with the airline. Some recounted heartwarming stories of employees who went out of their way to make every passenger feel welcome, creating an atmosphere of inclusivity that had been missing before. Other airlines took note, with some even beginning to explore their own versions of Equal Footing, contacting David to discuss how they could adopt similar practices. David's quiet initiative was becoming a beacon for change, a model of modern, compassionate service. Claire's transformation became an integral part of this narrative, especially as she took on an unexpected role within Equal Footing. Once hesitant, she had now embraced her position as a speaker and mentor, openly sharing her journey from prejudice to understanding. Her personal story of confronting her own biases became a focal point during the program's workshops. Employees and managers alike listened to her account of the incident with David, her initial defensiveness, and her eventual realization of the harm her actions had caused, not just to others, but to herself. Claire's presentations were raw and vulnerable, and her honesty struck a chord with audiences. She spoke about her biases, not as something to be ashamed of, but as a reality to confront and dismantle. At one point, she recounted a powerful memory that had emerged during her training. She remembered a passenger from years earlier, a young woman of color who had asked her for help, only to be met with an impatient response. Claire realized she had dismissed the woman simply because she didn't see her as important. The memory haunted her, a reminder of how many people she may have hurt without even realizing it. For Claire, each session was both penance and healing, a way to make amends by helping others see what she had once ignored. And her impact was profound. Employees who attended her sessions reported feeling more aware of their own biases. Many of them moved to reflect on their own past behaviors. Some even sought Claire out after sessions, sharing their own regrets and committing to treating people more fairly in the future. The change in Claire was no longer just an individual journey. It had become part of a collective transformation, inspiring everyone involved in Equal Footing to reflect on the power of empathy and understanding. As the program gained momentum, David's life became busier, filled with meetings, planning sessions, and public engagements. But despite the demands on his time, He felt a renewed sense of purpose. His wealth and influence had always allowed him to accomplish things, but this initiative felt different. It was personal, a cause he carried not just for himself, but for the countless people who had experienced prejudice in silence. He knew the value of equal footing lay not just in policies, but in the lives it could change. One afternoon, David received an unexpected invitation from a community organization in a neighboring city. They were hosting a diversity and inclusion summit, and they wanted him to deliver the keynote address. This organization had heard about equal footing and was eager to learn from David's experiences. The summit would be attended by leaders from various industries, all of whom were struggling with similar issues within their own businesses and institutions. When David arrived at the summit, he was greeted by community leaders, activists, and business executives who shared his passion for change. The energy in the room was palpable. As he took the stage, David could feel the weight of the moment. He began his speech with the story of his flight, describing the casual prejudice he had faced and the life-altering slap that had been the catalyst for equal footing. But he didn't dwell on his own experience. Instead, he shifted the focus to the audience, urging them to look within their own organizations and question whether every person was treated with the respect they deserved. "We often think of prejudice as something that happens somewhere else," David said, his voice resonating across the hall. "But the truth is, it's everywhere. It's in the assumptions we make, the judgments we pass, and the subtle ways we make others feel small. It's not enough to say we're inclusive. We have to show it in every interaction, every decision." The audience listened, captivated, as David described how equal footing had transformed the airline and how it had given employees a chance to confront their own biases in a constructive, supportive environment. He spoke about Claire, detailing her journey from defensiveness to humility, and how her willingness to change had inspired others to do the same. By the end of his speech, the room was silent, each person deep in thought. When he finished, a wave of applause erupted, echoing with the promise of change. After his speech, David was approached by people from all walks of life: small business owners, corporate executives, teachers, and even students, all eager to bring elements of equal footing into their own lives and workplaces. He spent hours talking with attendees, answering questions, and offering guidance on how they could create their own culture of respect and inclusivity. The summit left him energized, feeling as though his efforts were reaching further than he had ever imagined. In the months that followed, equal footing became a movement that extended well beyond the airline. Community centers, schools, corporations, and even local governments began adopting similar programs, drawing inspiration from David's initiative. People were learning to recognize their biases, to treat others with kindness, and to stand up against prejudice in all its forms. The stories of transformation and growth continued to pour in, each one a testament to the program's impact. For David, these successes were immensely fulfilling, but one story in particular stood out. A young man named Louis, an airline employee who had attended one of Claire's sessions, reached out to David to share his experience. Louis had grown up in a neighborhood where racial tensions were common, and he admitted that he had harbored biases of his own. But after participating in equal footing, he found himself questioning those assumptions. Inspired by Claire's honesty, Louis had decided to volunteer at a local community center that served underprivileged youth, many of whom came from backgrounds different from his own. His perspective had shifted, and he now saw these kids not as others, but as individuals with dreams and struggles just like his. David was deeply moved by Louis's story. It was moments like these that made the initiative worthwhile, the tangible evidence that real change was happening. Equal footing wasn't just changing the culture of a single airline, it was changing lives, one person at a time. As the initiative continued to grow, David's life found a new rhythm. He was no longer just a businessman or a philanthropist. He had become a bridge between people, a symbol of what could be achieved when empathy and understanding were placed at the forefront. The experience had transformed him as well, deepening his sense of purpose and expanding his vision of what he could accomplish. One evening, as David reflected on everything that had unfolded since that fateful flight, he realized that he was part of something larger than himself. His journey, which had begun with a simple act of standing up for his dignity, had evolved into a movement that was transforming countless lives. The incident on the plane was no longer just a story of injustice. It was a story of hope, resilience, and the power of change. And as David looked out at the world, he knew that this was only the beginning. As David's Equal Footing initiative reached new heights, its impact started seeping into other aspects of society, stretching beyond the corporate world and into neighborhoods, schools, and even the media. News outlets picked up on stories of transformation coming from unlikely places, and David's work was beginning to inspire others to start conversations in areas where prejudice had long been ignored or quietly tolerated. One day, David received an invitation from a well-known television network that wanted to create a documentary series on equal footing and its ripple effect across communities. The network hoped to showcase not only the impact within the airline, but also how it had inspired various individuals to reevaluate their own perspectives, and in some cases, embark on journeys of personal change. At first, David hesitated. He was concerned that media attention might sensationalize the program or reduce it to mere entertainment. But after discussing it with his team and some of the people who had been deeply moved by equal footing, he decided to take part. This could be an opportunity to bring the conversation to a wider audience, encouraging people across the nation to confront their biases and embrace change. The documentary team arrived at David's headquarters with a clear mission: to tell the human stories behind the movement. They interviewed employees, passengers, executives, and community members who had participated in the initiative, each sharing how equal footing had impacted their lives in profound ways. The interviews were raw and candid. Claire, who had now become a central figure in the program, agreed to be filmed, her willingness to publicly share her transformation adding a deeply personal element to the series. She described the shame and regret she had felt, but more importantly, she spoke about the redemption she found in facing her own biases head-on and the courage it took to make things right. One of the most memorable scenes in the documentary featured a group of flight attendants and customer service staff who had undergone the equal footing training. Among them was Louis, the young man who had shared his story with David. He described how he used to assume the worst of certain passengers based solely on their appearance or accents, a prejudice he hadn't even realized he harbored until the training forced him to confront it. Now, he said, he approached each passenger with an open mind, focusing on the shared humanity that connected them rather than the superficial differences that divided them. As the series aired, it sparked discussions across the country. Online forums buzzed with people sharing their own stories of experiencing or witnessing prejudice, and many began calling for similar initiatives in their workplaces, schools, and communities. The response was overwhelming. It was as if David's message had struck a nerve, touching a desire within people to see a world where everyone was treated with dignity. Community centers began hosting equal footing screenings, followed by open discussions where people could share their thoughts and reflect on how they, too, could be agents of change. It became more than just a television series. It was a movement that people felt they could take part in. As the initiative gained traction, David began receiving letters and messages from viewers, each one expressing gratitude and sharing personal reflections. Many of the letters came from people who had once held prejudices themselves. Some were confessions from those who had recognized unkind behavior in their past, while others expressed a newfound commitment to be better, kinder, and more aware. One letter, in particular, stood out to David. It was from a woman named Esther, a retired teacher who had grown up in a different time, one where biases were normalized and rarely questioned. In her letter, she shared how, after watching the series, she realized that she had carried prejudices that she had passed down to her own children and students over the years. She described the pain and shame of realizing the harm her words and actions may have caused, and she expressed a deep desire to make amends by educating her grandchildren about empathy and equality. David was touched by Esther's letter and responded personally, thanking her for her honesty and courage. He felt it was a powerful reminder that change could happen at any age, in any circumstance. Esther's story became a cornerstone of his future speeches, and he often referenced it as an example of the program's ability to foster self-reflection and growth. Meanwhile, within the airline itself, equal footing had started to reshape its corporate culture. Employees were encouraged to give feedback, share experiences, and hold each other accountable. Managers began noticing positive changes in customer satisfaction and employee morale, as staff members felt a renewed sense of purpose and pride in their work. The airline introduced new protocols, emphasizing that respect and dignity were not only expected from staff, but extended to them as well. Stories emerged of employees helping passengers with more patience, offering compassionate responses during difficult situations, and bridging divides with simple acts of kindness. However, the initiative was not without its challenges. There were some employees and even managers who resisted the changes, dismissing them as unnecessary or even too politically correct. Some felt uncomfortable with the idea of confronting their biases, while others doubted the effectiveness of such an approach. David was aware of these reservations and knew that change, especially on such a deep level, wouldn't be easy for everyone. To address these concerns, he arranged for workshops specifically designed for those who struggled with the program, creating spaces where they could express their concerns openly without judgment. Slowly, even the skeptics began to see the value of equal footing. They saw the camaraderie it fostered, the positive feedback from passengers, and the way it was improving their work environment. Over time, the pushback softened, and more people came on board with a genuine commitment to the values of respect and empathy. David's efforts also caught the attention of influential figures in politics and the business world, who saw equal footing as a model for promoting inclusivity on a national level. Lawmakers reached out to David, inviting him to join discussions about potential legislation aimed at encouraging similar programs in various industries. David attended these meetings, not as a politician, but as an advocate for humanity. He argued that businesses had a responsibility not just to make a profit, but to create spaces where people felt valued and safe. As time went on, David realized that equal footing was transforming not only his life and the lives of those who had been directly involved, but was also inspiring systemic change. Schools across the country were incorporating similar programs into their curriculums, teaching students about empathy and respect from a young age. The program even caught the eye of international organizations, with leaders from other countries reaching out to David, eager to bring the initiative to their own industries and communities. 1 year after Equal Footing was launched, the airline hosted a celebration to honor the initiative's success. The event was filled with employees, passengers, community leaders, and even some of the people who had written to David. Claire was there, her once somber face now radiating with pride as she shared stories of the lives she had touched. Luis, too, attended, proudly telling his story of personal growth and the connections he had built with people from backgrounds different from his own. David took the stage to deliver a closing speech, his voice filled with gratitude and humility. He looked out at the audience, seeing not only familiar faces, but also strangers who had come together because of a shared commitment to kindness and equality. Equal footing began as a response to a single moment of injustice, he said, but it has become so much more than that. It is a testament to the power of empathy, to the courage it takes to confront our own shortcomings, and to the strength we find in each other when we choose to walk the path of understanding. This initiative isn't just about me or this airline. It's about all of us. It's about the world we want to create, one where everyone is treated with respect, no matter where they come from or who they are. As he finished speaking, the audience rose in applause, the room filled with a sense of unity and purpose. David felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that equal footing had achieved something far beyond his original vision. It had planted seeds of change, not just in policies or procedures, but in people's hearts. Leaving the event that night, David walked through the city, feeling a renewed connection to the world around him. He knew that this journey wasn't over, that there would always be more work to do, more conversations to have, and more minds to open. But as he looked up at the night sky, he felt a quiet certainty that the world was moving, however slowly, toward a place where everyone could indeed stand on equal footing. And that, he knew, was worth everything. In the months following the celebration of equal footing, the initiative continued to grow, fueled by the momentum of those who had experienced its transformative effects firsthand. David became a well-known advocate for empathy and inclusivity, a role he wore with both pride and humility. What had started as a single, unexpected incident on a plane had turned into a vast network of connected individuals who were championing respect, equity, and understanding in every corner of their communities. As the movement expanded, David knew it was time to solidify its impact beyond the airline, envisioning ways to make equal footing a permanent fixture in society. David met with educators, psychologists, and community leaders to discuss how the core principles of equal footing could be adapted to various institutions. Schools became a primary focus. David believed that if children were taught empathy and respect from an early age, they would grow into adults who naturally embodied those values. He partnered with educational experts to create a curriculum called Pathways to Understanding, which was piloted in several schools across the country. The curriculum included interactive lessons, role-playing scenarios, and discussions designed to help students recognize and challenge their own biases, appreciate diversity, and practice compassionate communication. The response from students and teachers was overwhelmingly positive. Teachers noticed that the lessons helped reduce bullying and fostered an inclusive atmosphere in their classrooms. Students shared stories of how they had started treating each other with more kindness and understanding, and some even brought the lessons home, prompting their families to consider the importance of empathy in their own lives. Parents wrote to David, expressing gratitude for the changes they saw in their children, with many saying that they, too, had started to reflect on their own behavior as a result. Inspired by the success in schools, David decided to take equal footing to the corporate world. He believed that companies had an enormous influence on the culture of society and could play a crucial role in promoting respect and inclusivity. Working with his team, he developed a corporate training program that focused not only on sensitivity and bias awareness, but also on practical tools for conflict resolution and collaborative problem-solving. Unlike traditional corporate training programs, which were often viewed as mere formalities, David's approach emphasized personal accountability and encouraged employees to take an active role in fostering a respectful workplace culture. The program was piloted in several major corporations, and its effects were quickly apparent. Managers reported that employees were more engaged, more respectful in their interactions, and more willing to work collaboratively. The training sessions included real-life scenarios, drawing from stories shared by employees themselves, which helped everyone see the relevance of the program in their day-to-day lives. Employees who had once been skeptical of equal footing found themselves moved by the personal stories shared during the sessions, and many left with a renewed commitment to building a culture of inclusivity within their teams. David's influence reached even higher levels when lawmakers took notice of the success of equal footing and began discussions about implementing similar programs at a national level. David was invited to speak before Congress, where he advocated for the establishment of nationwide standards for empathy training in schools, government agencies, and public services. He argued that fostering a culture of respect and understanding could reduce societal conflicts, strengthen communities, and create a more harmonious society. Standing before Congress, David shared powerful stories from individuals who had been transformed by equal footing. He told them about Claire, whose journey from prejudice to redemption had inspired thousands, and about Louis, whose newfound empathy had not only changed his life, but also helped bridge divides in his community. He spoke about Esther, the retired teacher, and how her willingness to reflect on her past and teach her grandchildren about empathy served as a testament to the enduring power of change. His words resonated with the lawmakers, and after his speech, there was a sense that they, too, had been touched by the vision he painted of a society grounded in mutual respect and compassion. David's testimony sparked a series of hearings and debates, leading to the proposal of a bill aimed at promoting empathy and inclusivity training in educational institutions, public services, and government agencies nationwide. The bill emphasized the importance of not only acknowledging diversity, but also teaching individuals to genuinely understand and embrace different perspectives. It called for funding to support empathy-based curricula in schools and training programs in workplaces, as well as grants for community organizations working to bridge cultural divides. Back home, David's community began to take on a life of its own. Inspired by equal footing, local leaders organized regular gatherings where people could come together to discuss issues of prejudice and inequality. These gatherings, known as unity circles, provided a safe space for people to share their experiences and listen to others without judgment. Each unity circle ended with a collective commitment to take small actions in daily life that promoted understanding and kindness, from helping a stranger to standing up against discrimination. Over time, these circles grew, with neighbors, co-workers, and families joining in to participate in this movement of unity and healing. One evening, David was invited to a unity circle in his own neighborhood, where he was given a chance to speak to the community that had supported him from the beginning. As he looked around the room, he saw faces from all walks of life, young and old, different races, religions, and backgrounds, all gathered with a shared purpose. In a humble voice, David shared his gratitude for each person who had committed to being a part of this journey. "None of this would have been possible without each of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You are the true champions of equal footing. Each time you choose kindness, each time you listen with an open heart, you are creating a ripple effect that goes far beyond what any of us can see. It is because of you that we are moving closer to a world where everyone stands on equal footing." The audience responded with a standing ovation, their applause echoing with both admiration and a deep sense of shared purpose. After the unity circle, people approached David to share how equal footing had changed their lives. Some spoke of how they had reconciled with family members they had been estranged from. Others shared stories of standing up against injustice in their workplaces, and many simply thanked him for inspiring them to be better. As the years passed, equal footing became a fixture in society. Schools across the country adopted empathy and inclusivity programs. Companies redefined their values to prioritize respect, and communities held unity circles as a regular practice. David's initiative had transformed into a movement that no longer needed his constant guidance. It had taken on a life of its own, carried forward by the people who believed in its message. David himself began to step back from public life, content to watch from the sidelines as the movement continued to grow. He felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had done his part to make the world a better place. He spent more time with his family, traveling and enjoying the simple pleasures he had often overlooked during his years of building businesses and creating change. Yet even in his quieter moments, he continued to receive letters, messages, and invitations from people whose lives had been touched by equal footing. Each story reminded him that the impact of his work would endure long after he was gone. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, David thought back to that fateful flight, to the moment when a simple journey home had turned into a mission he hadn't expected but had embraced fully. He realized that the slap he had received that day had not only awakened him, but had ignited a spark that had spread across the world. It had shown him the power of resilience, of standing up for what was right, and of transforming pain into purpose. And as he watched the sky turn shades of pink and gold, David felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that he had helped pave the way for a kinder, more compassionate world. A world where everyone could indeed stand on equal footing. In the quiet of that evening, he smiled to himself, grateful for the journey that had led him here. and for the legacy he had left behind for generations to come.